The candles in the great dining room of Trentham House burned 30 strong the night Lady Cecily Drummond arranged the seating, and every one of them threw its light across the same truth. A young woman in a plain gray gown had been placed below the housekeeper and the head footman, at the very foot of the table, where the draught came in beneath the door, and where no one of consequence would look. Mira sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her back very straight. She did not look up at the chandelier, though its blaze would have been something to see from that remove. She looked, instead, at the card before her plate, where her name had been written in Lady Cecily's own hand, without title, without prefix, a bare surname with a comma after it, as though she were a parcel to be claimed. The card read, Voss, M. Nothing more. Across the length of the table, 30 guests arranged themselves in the candlelight, their silk and satin catching the flame in amber and cream and gold. Lady Cecily sat at the head in deep burgundy, her jewels at her throat catching every movement of the air. Beside her on the right sat Miss Philippa Greer, whose gown was the color of pale water and whose pearls had belonged to her grandmother. And at the far end of the long mahogany table, in the position of secondary host, sat the Earl of Marlow. He had not looked at the seating arrangement. He had taken his chair without glancing at the cards, because he knew his own household and its habits, and he did not expect anything in them to surprise him. His face was the kind of face that had learned to disclose very little, jaw and brow carved by 31 years of practicing that discipline, his gray coat sitting on him with the particular ease of a man who has never needed to announce himself. Mira did not look at him either. She had been in Trentham House for 2 days, and she had learned already that the Earl of Marlow was not a man who noticed women seated below the footman at dinner. She was not yet certain he noticed much of anything, except the management of his estate and the welfare of his ward. What she did not know, in that moment, with the draught at her ankles and the candle before her guttering in it, was that Edmund Calvert had noticed her at the very hour she arrived. She had come 40 miles from Bath in a hired carriage with a letter of introduction from her late father's solicitor and a trunk containing 4 dresses, 2 of which were plain enough for day wear, and 2 of which she had retrimmed herself at the cuffs and collar, so that they might serve for evenings. She had arrived in the courtyard on a gray November afternoon, the sky pressing down over the Trentham Oaks, and she had stepped out of the carriage without assistance because the footman who came out was young and uncertain, and she did not wish to make him feel he had failed. It was that small act he had seen from the first-floor window of his study. Not her face, not her gown, not the worn leather of her trunk. The quality of her consideration for the young footman. He had watched her pause on the cobblestones, look up at the house with a directness that was neither deference nor challenge, and then follow the housekeeper inside. He had stood at the glass for a moment after she disappeared, and then he had returned to the papers on his desk. Lady Cecily had received Mira in the yellow drawing-room. She had read the letter of introduction twice, her expression settling into the particular arrangement of a woman who has spent 40 years measuring the quality of arrivals against a fixed internal scale. The letter confirmed that Mira's father, the late Count of Ashvale, under letters patent issued by the Duchy of Braunfeld, had died the previous spring. It confirmed that Mira had funds sufficient to maintain herself as a paying guest through the winter season. It confirmed her name as Mira Voss, daughter of the Count. Lady Cecily had folded the letter and set it on the side table beside her tea. "Miss Voss," she said, not unkindly, but with a precision that closed the question, "we are delighted to receive you." Not Countess, not even Lady. Miss Voss, and the folded letter put away like a bill already paid. Mira had said, "You are very kind, Lady Cecily," and let the correction pass, because she had made the 40-mile journey for reasons that had nothing to do with insisting on forms of address in a yellow drawing room. Her father's letters patent were in the keeping of Mr. Aldous Fenn, the solicitor who had accompanied Edmund to Trentham to conduct business regarding the estate. She had known Mr. Fenn would be here. She had come, in part, to retrieve those papers and to establish, quietly and without drama, what her father had left her. A title she could not eat. It was true. A title that in England was not equivalent to an English peerage. Also true. A title that was, nonetheless, real, documented, and hers, and that she had watched people step over as though it were a carpet worn to the boards. The dinner on the second night, therefore, came as no surprise. It came as a confirmation. If you have ever found yourself in a room that has decided, before you opened your mouth, what you are worth, then you will know something of what Mira felt as she unfolded her napkin. It is a very specific temperature, that room. Warm from the candles, and cold from the indifference, and it sits against the back of the neck, like a hand that is not quite pushing. She ate her soup with care, and said nothing to the housekeeper on her left, who was mortified and showed it by addressing herself entirely to the footman on her right. The footman on her right, a man named Briggs who had been at Trentham since before Edmund inherited, stared at the candle before him and did not speak either. The evening wore on in this way, the conversation at the far end of the table warm and continuous, Philippa's laugh rising once with genuine brightness, and at the foot of the table, the sound of the draught and the careful sound of Mira's spoon. She did not look at Edmund. She ate. She endured. She kept her hands steady. He looked at her once. The table was long enough that it required an effort, and the effort was deniable. A man simply surveying his dining room. His gaze traveled the length of the candle-lit table from his end to hers, and it rested for a fraction of a second at the foot, where the woman in the gray gown sat with her spine very straight and her face held in an expression of total composed neutrality. He looked away before anyone could have named it looking. Mira did not see it. She was watching the candle gutter. The next morning brought frost on the north-facing windows and a domestic disruption that had nothing to do with her, and yet chose her as its resolution. She had been walking the upper corridor with her shawl around her shoulders, on her way to the library where Mr. Fenn had told her she might find the estate records she needed to review, when she heard it. A child's sharp cry, and behind it, a sound like a leather strap striking a wooden surface, and then the cry again, higher. She had not hesitated. She pushed open the schoolroom door. Thomas was 7 years old and slight for it. Standing at the far end of the schoolroom table with his hands pressed flat against the surface and his face turned away from Mrs. Holt, the governess, who stood over him with a cane ruler held at striking height. His copybook was open before him, and the letters on the page were unsteady, the handwriting of a child who had been crying before he sat down to write. Mira crossed the room in 4 steps and placed herself between the child and the governess. Mrs. Holt said, "This is no concern of yours, Miss Voss." Mira said very quietly, "Put it down." It was not a suggestion. It carried no volume, no heat, no trembling. It was the voice of a woman who has been told since childhood what she may and may not do, and who has chosen, in this specific moment, to set that knowledge aside. Mrs. Holt put the ruler down. There was a long pause in which the schoolroom's small fire crackled, and Thomas did not move, and then Mira turned and knelt so that she was level with his face. She said, "What is the letter giving you trouble?" And Thomas, after a moment, pointed at the copybook, and she looked, and she said, "The G? That is a difficult letter. Let me show you how my father taught me." And she picked up his pen, and she drew the letter 3 times beside his own attempts. And she said, "Now you." He drew the letter. It was better. Not perfect, but better. She was not aware that the schoolroom door had not fully closed behind her. She was not aware that Edmund had been passing the corridor on his way to the east wing when the sound of the ruler reached him too, and that he had stopped outside the door, and that he had heard every word through the gap, and that he had stood there longer than the exchange required, watching through the inch of open door a woman he had placed below his servants at dinner put herself between his ward and a woman paid to have authority over him, at no practical benefit to herself, and at considerable cost to whatever standing she might have maintained by minding her own affairs. He stood in the corridor for a moment, after she began teaching the boy to draw the G. Then he walked away, his face unchanged, and went to find Mr. Fenn. That evening, as the guests assembled in the yellow drawing room before supper, Edmund crossed the room to where Mira stood near the fireplace with a glass of wine she had not yet tasted. "Miss Voss," he said. She turned. He was nearer than she expected, and she felt the adjustment her body made to his proximity before she could prevent it, a slight heightening of attention, the way a room becomes more itself when a window is opened in it. "The schoolroom," he said. "Mrs. Holt will be replaced before the end of the week." Mira said, "That is between you and Mrs. Holt, my lord." He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the firelight giving his gray eyes a quality she could not quite name, something that was not warmth and was not coldness either, something in between that she had no word for yet. Then he said, "Come and meet Thomas properly. He has been asking about you." It was a command, and she read it as such. The flat declarative sentence of a man who did not phrase his wishes as questions. She followed him across the drawing room, and she told herself that she followed because she wished to see the child, not because the quality of his stillness when he issued the command had done something to the air around it. Thomas was in the corner of the drawing room with a book open in his lap, arranged there by some adult hand that expected him to be decorative and quiet. He looked up when Edmund brought Mira to him, and his face arranged itself into the careful blankness of a child who has been disappointed often enough to protect himself from the approach. Mira sat in the chair beside him without being invited, which was not done, and said, "What are you reading?" "It is about maps," Thomas said. "Where in the world?" she asked, and he turned the book to show her. And they were examining a page of the Eastern Mediterranean together when Edmund stepped back and watched them, with a face that disclosed nothing, except that his hands, at his sides, were very still. What the guests in the drawing room saw, if they happened to glance over, was the Earl of Marlowe standing near the corner with an expression of measured attention, while his ward spoke to the woman in the gray gown. What the guests did not see, because it was not legible at that distance, was that his attention had traveled, briefly, beyond the child, and had come to rest on the woman's profile, and had stayed there until she laughed at something. Thomas said, a small sound, quickly suppressed, and then had moved away as though it had never settled at all. Lady Cecily saw it. She said nothing at the time, but she folded the information away with the same precision she had used on the letter of introduction, and in the days that followed, she began to act on it. The library came 3 days later. Mira had established a habit of working there in the afternoons, when the house's social machinery was occupied elsewhere, reviewing the documents Mr. Fenn had agreed to walk her through regarding the Ashvale letters patent. The library at Trentham was a long room on the south side of the house, shelved floor to ceiling in oak gone almost black with age, the windows facing the winter garden and letting in a flat gray light that was adequate for reading. She was at the reading table when Edmund came in. He did not announce himself. He went to the shelf on the east wall that held the estate accounts, took down a volume without looking at her, and carried it to the table. He sat at the opposite end, 6 feet of oak between them, and opened the account book. They worked in silence for a while, the fire doing its work behind the grate, and then Mira asked, without looking up, whether the library held anything on the Duchy of Braunfeld, as she had a specific question about the form of the letters patent her father had held, and whether English law gave them any standing in property disputes. He looked up from the account book. He said, "Your father was a continental count." "Yes," she said. "And English courts do not generally recognize continental titles for legal standing in property questions." "I know," she said. "I am not asking about legal standing. I am asking about social standing, which is a different question, and one the law does not answer." There was a pause. He said, "No, the library does not hold anything on Braunfeld specifically." And then, after a moment, "But Mr. Fenn might." "I know," she said again. "Mr. Fenn has the letters patent. He is reviewing them for me." Edmund looked at her for a moment with the expression she had been learning to read, the one that was not warmth and not coldness, the one that lived in the space between his discipline and whatever the discipline was keeping in. He said, "You have been in England how long?" 3 years, she said. "Since my father's posting ended." "And in those 3 years, how many drawing rooms have declined to use your title?" The question was not unkind. It was the question of a man who wished to understand the shape of a thing before he judged it. Mira looked at him directly, which was something she did not often do in social rooms because it tended to unsettle people. "All of them," she said. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the account book. She did not know, in that moment, what the pause had cost him. She did not know that his wife, Catherine, had died 4 years ago in a house he had left to attend a vote in the Lords, a vote he could have abstained from, and that she had died in the night with the child that came too early, and that the child had not survived either, and that the particular expression on his face when Mira said all of them was the expression of a man who recognized, from the inside, what it meant to be failed by the very structures designed to protect you. She could not have known that. She saw only that he closed the account book, rose without ceremony, and said, "I will speak to Fenn," and left. The room held the warmth of his having been in it for a moment after the door closed. She made herself return to the letters patent documents. Lady Cecily moved 2 days before the winter assembly. She came to Mira's room herself, which was the kind of gesture that announced its gravity from the moment the footman knocked. She sat in the small chair by the window, her hands folded, her pearls arranged at her throat, and she said, in the voice of a woman who is being extremely reasonable, that Trentham House would be closing the guest rooms after the assembly, as the family had private business to conduct, and that she hoped Miss Voss had enjoyed her stay. The assembly was in 4 days. The solicitors who held Mira's lease on her bathrooms had let those rooms to another party in October. She had nowhere else to go before the new year. "I appreciate your honesty, Lady Cecily," Mira said. Lady Cecily said, "A young woman without settled connections ought to be very careful about where she directs her attention during a house party, for her own reputation." Mira met her eyes. "I have directed my attention at the library and the estate records," she said, "and at your nephew's ward, who was being struck across the hands by a governess who has since been replaced. I am comfortable with the direction of my attention." Lady Cecily rose. "The assembly," she said, "will be the last public engagement of the season. I expect you understand what that means for any arrangements you may have hoped to make." She left. The small chair still held the impression of her sitting in it, and the cold from the window crept around it. Mira sat for a long time with her hands open on her lap, looking at her father's signet ring on her right hand. It was a heavy ring for a woman's hand, gold set with carnelian, the Ashvale arms cut into the stone in mirror image for sealing. Her father had given it to her the last winter of his life, when it had become clear the posting would not be renewed, and he had no son to leave it to. "You are the last of us," he had said, in German, because he always spoke German when he was serious. "And you carry the name forward." She had worn it since. 3 years of English drawing rooms, and she had worn it every day. And in those 3 years, not one person of consequence had asked what the arms signified. She looked at the ring for a long time. Then she went to find Mr. Fenn. She found him in the small sitting room he had been given for his paperwork, surrounded by document boxes and the smell of aged wax seals. He was a man of 50 or so, precise and unhurried, with the quality of attention that came from decades of reading documents that decided other people's lives. She laid the ring on the table before him and said, "I need to know whether the letters patent my father held would be recognized by the Assembly's household at Trentham if presented formally." Mr. Fenn looked at the ring for a long moment. He picked it up, turned it, held it near the candle. He said, "The Ashvale arms. Yes. Your father's letters patent from the Duchy of Braunfeld are in my custody, as you know. They are signed and sealed by the Duke of Braunfeld and countersigned by the British Foreign Office as a matter of registration. They are not an English title. They are, however, formally documented." He set the ring down. "If they were presented in a public context, with the ring as corroboration, any person of ordinary education would be obliged to acknowledge them as legitimate." Mira said, "And would you present them, if I asked?" He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "I believe I would feel professionally obligated to present accurate documentation," when the record was in question. She picked up the ring and put it back on her hand. The assembly was held in Trentham's East Ballroom, which was a room that justified the name, long enough to accommodate a country dance of 40 couples, lit by 3 chandeliers that had been cleaned for the occasion, the wax and the crystal together, producing a light that was almost aggressive in its evenness. The guests from the house party were joined by 30 or so neighbors from the surrounding county, and the room held its warmth against the November dark outside the windows. Mira had dressed with particular care. Her gown was white with a pale blue stripe, retrimmed at the bodice with silver thread she had bought in Bath, and saved for a reason she had not, until now, fully named. She wore the ring on her right hand, where it had always been. She wore her mother's pearl earrings. She looked, in the mirror, before she left her room, exactly as her mother had looked in the portrait that had hung in the house in Vienna. A woman of 23, who understood precisely what the room would think of her, and who had chosen to enter it anyway. She stood at the edge of the ballroom and watched the assembly arrange itself. Edmund was near the far wall, speaking to a neighbor whose name she did not know, his face in its habitual composure, his shoulders carrying the room's authority in the particular way of men who have never had to claim it. Thomas was not present, being 7 years old and appropriately in bed. Philippa was at Lady Cecily's side, and Lady Cecily was speaking to several people at once, in the way of a woman managing a room she considers her own. The evening moved through its early acts with the predictable grace of a Regency house party in full ceremony, the opening dances, the promenading, the careful management of proximity and audience. Edmund danced once with Philippa, and Lady Cecily watched with the satisfaction of a woman who had arranged the conclusion before the evening began. Mira stood at the edge of the room with a glass of wine she did not taste, and she told herself that this was as it should be, that she had not come to Trentham for Edmund Calvert, that she had come for Mr. Fenn and the letters patent and the quiet confirmation of her own name. She almost believed it. She was still at the edge of the room when Lady Cecily called for attention, the practiced call of a hostess managing a room, and the music stilled and the assembly turned, and Lady Cecily said, in a voice that carried with perfect clarity across the 40 couples and their attendants, "I have the great pleasure of announcing what many of us have long hoped to see confirmed. My nephew, Edmund, Earl of Marlow, and Miss Philippa Greer, whose families have been friends these 20 years, have agreed to a formal understanding. We look forward to celebrating with them in the spring." The room moved through its proper response. A collective warmth, applause, the neighboring families nodding with the satisfaction of people who have known this was coming. Philippa, to her credit, looked pleased and also, for a fraction of a second, uncertain, a small doubt that crossed her face and was suppressed by her training before anyone further than arm's length could have named it. Edmund, across the room, went very still. Mira did not move. She stood at the edge of the assembly with her glass in her hand and the ring on her finger, and she felt the room shift beneath its surface, the way a frozen river shifts when a temperature change begins beneath the ice, invisible from above, consequential below. She thought, with the part of her mind that continued to function clearly even when everything else was refusing its instructions. This is the end of it, then. She had known it was the end. She had told herself she had known. She set her glass down on the nearest table, and she crossed to where Mr. Fenn was standing near the east wall, with his customary expression of professional calm. She said, very quietly, "Now." Mr. Fenn reached into the document case at his side and produced a folded packet bearing several seals, the outermost of which was crimson and bore the impress of the Duchy of Braunfeld. Then Edmund moved. He crossed the ballroom in the silence that follows an announcement, and he did not go to Philippa. He went to the east wall. The room registered this displacement the way a room registers a change in weather. A collective reorientation. 30 faces adjusting their assumptions. Lady Cecily's smile held for 2 full seconds on what it had been before it began, almost imperceptibly, to recalibrate. Edmund stopped in front of Mira and Mr. Fenn. He said, to Mr. Fenn, "You have something to present." Mr. Fenn said, "I do, my lord." And he unfolded the packet, and the paper opened across his hands, the seals catching the chandelier light. And he said, in a voice calibrated for a room rather than for a private conversation, "These are the letters patent issued by the Duchy of Braunfeld, countersigned and registered with the British Foreign Office in the year 1812, confirming the title of Count of Aschweiler upon Heinrich Voss and his legitimate heirs. The ring present on the hand of Miss Voss," he paused, the pause deliberate, "bears the Ashvale arms in correct form, which corroborates the patent's inheritance clause. The holder of this document is Mira Voss, Countess of Ashvale, by right of her father's title and the inheritance clause therein." The room did not speak. Mira stood in the silence with the ring on her hand and the chandelier's light coming down across the whole of it, and she looked at no one because the occasion required steadiness, and she was concentrating on providing it. Edmund turned to face the assembly. He was not a man who raised his voice for effect, and he did not raise it now. He said, as though the words had been sitting in him since the night he had watched her step out of a hired carriage and refused to embarrass a young footman. "Countess of Ashvale." 3 words only, addressed to the room, not to her, formal and irrevocable, the social machinery of an English earl placing a title on a woman in front of 30 witnesses who had, 11 days ago, watched her eat below the servants. The room absorbed it. Lady Cecily's fan moved twice, once in the ordinary direction, and once in the direction of a woman whose internal revision was working faster than her external expression. She understood, with the sharpness of a woman who has navigated society for 40 years, what had just occurred. Not a confrontation, not a drama, Not a son defying his aunt in a ballroom. A correction. An accurate correction. Made without heat. In the same room where the inaccuracy had been allowed to stand. Philippa looked at Edmund across the room with an expression that was not wounded, but was genuinely surprised. And then she looked at Mira. And the thing that crossed her face before her composure reassembled itself was recognition. The particular recognition of a young woman who has been told all her life that she was the correct choice, and who has, for the first time, seen what it looks like when the choosing is done freely. Lady Cecily said, into the room's held pause, "We are delighted to welcome the Countess of Ashvale." The sentence came out without a fracture. It cost her something, and the cost was visible only in the 2 rapid breaths she took before she said it. Edmund turned back to Mira. He was very near, nearer than the ballroom's ordinary geometry required, and his face was doing something it had not done in the drawing room, in the library, in any of the moments she had been watching and misreading. The discipline was still there, the jaw and the brow and the practiced stillness. But something behind the surface of it had shifted, and the shift was, at last, legible. He said very quietly, for her only, "I should have said it at dinner." She said after a moment, "You did not know it at dinner." He said, "I knew enough." She held his gaze and felt something in her chest perform the specific action of a thing that has been held very tightly for a very long time, finally being released. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a slight easing, the way a hand uncurls from something it has been gripping. She said, "What did you know?" He said, in the level, short declarative register that she had first read as coldness and now understood as the architecture of a man who spoke only when he was certain, that whoever placed you below the servants made an error, that the error required correcting, that I was slow. Around them, the assembly was resuming its motion, the music beginning again, the neighbors finding their partners, the evening continuing in the manner of evenings that have absorbed something significant and chosen to proceed. Thomas's name was mentioned once behind them by one of the neighboring mothers, approvingly, which meant his reputation was being managed at a distance by someone who thought well of Trentham. Edmund said, "Will you dance?" It was a command in the shape of a question, and she recognized the shape now. She recognized it as the shape that care wore when it had been educated not to make itself vulnerable. She said, "Yes." They danced. It was a measured, formal dance, the kind that required attention and provided, under cover of its attention, proximity and conversation, and the movement of 2 bodies in the same deliberate direction. She could feel the controlled precision of how he led, the slight pressure of his hand at her back, that was not decorative but functional, steadying her through the turn. And she thought with some part of her mind that was still keeping accounts. This is what 40 miles in a hired carriage comes to. This specific turn in this specific light, with this man's hand at her back, steady. After the dancing, the evening began to close. The neighboring families found their cloaks and their carriages. The house guests drifted toward the corridors. Philippa said goodnight to Mira with a grace that was entirely genuine, and said, "I hope Trentham has been agreeable." And Mira said, "More than I expected." And Philippa smiled and was gone. Lady Cecily did not approach Mira again that night. What she did, which Mira saw from across the emptying ballroom, was stand near the fireplace with her fan closed in both hands and her eyes on the middle distance, making the internal calculations of a woman who is revising a policy she has held for decades. It was not a pleasant process to watch, but it was not a dishonest one either. Lady Cecily was not a cruel woman. She was a woman whose entire way of understanding the world required that rank be visible at a glance, and she had been presented with evidence that it was not. And she was working with that evidence in the only way she knew how. Mira thought, watching her. She will come to it, in time. She will not enjoy it. But she will come to it. The next morning, Trentham House was quiet under 2 inches of new snow. Mira came downstairs early, as she had done every morning of her stay, because she had learned that the house's best hour was the hour before the household arranged itself for company, when the fires were made up and the rooms held only the smell of wood smoke and the particular silence of a house resting in itself. She went to the library. Thomas was already there. He was in the chair by the window, the map book open in his lap, watching the snow come down across the winter garden. He looked up when she came in and said, with the directness of a child who has decided someone is trustworthy, "It will be deep enough for boots by noon." "I believe you are right," she said, and came to sit in the chair beside him, as she had done in the drawing room without being invited. They sat for a while in companionable quiet, the snow accumulating on the sill outside and the fire doing what fires do in libraries. Thomas showed her a map of the Rhine Valley, and she told him something her father had said about the difference between how a map looks and how a country feels when you are standing in it. And Thomas considered this with the seriousness of a child who is genuinely interested and not performing interest. Edmund came in 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the 2 of them at the window, and then he came to stand behind Thomas's chair, one hand resting on the chair back. He said to Mira, "I have written to Bath. There is a house on Camden Street available for let from January, if you have need of it, but—" He paused. "Trentham is not closing its guest rooms." Mira looked at him. He said, "The announcement Lady Cecily made last evening was made without my knowledge. I have since spoken with her." Mira said carefully, "And Miss Greer?" He said, "Philippa is a good woman who deserves to be someone's first choice. She was not mine." He was looking directly at her, with the same directness she had noted from the day she arrived and had learned to catalogue as one of his characteristics rather than one of his judgments. "You came here for the letters patent." "Yes, and for something else." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Thomas, who was ostentatiously examining the Rhine Valley and showing every sign of being a child who is listening to everything. She said, "I am not certain I knew what else I came for until recently." "No," he said. "Neither did I." Thomas turned a page. Edmund reached into his coat pocket, and from it he brought out the ring she had given Mr. Fenn the previous night for safekeeping along with the letters patent, and he held it out to her. And she understood from the way he held it, across his open palm rather than pinched between 2 fingers, that he had thought about how to give it back. She took it from his hand. His fingers closed briefly over hers as she did, not grasping, not prolonged, simply present, the slight warmth of it crossing the cold morning air between them like the first credible evidence of spring. She put the ring back on her right hand, where it had always been. Thomas said, without looking up from the map book, "Are you staying then?" Mira looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Mira. The fire behind the grate took a breath of its own, and the snow outside the window came down across the Trentham oaks, and the library held its warmth around the 3 of them in the early morning quiet. She said, "Yes." It was the kind of morning that does not announce itself. The snow went on falling. The map book remained open to the Rhine Valley. The ring sat on her finger, the carnelian cool and the gold already warming. In the drawing room down the corridor, someone's clock struck 8, and in the kitchen passage beyond that, The household was beginning its day in the ordinary way of households that have found their footing again. There was no dramatic light, no ceremony. There was only the fire and the snow and a 7-year-old boy who had already returned to his maps, and a man standing behind a chair with his hand at his side, 3 feet from a woman who wore her father's name on her finger and who was, at last, in a room that had chosen to see it. She was home. If Mira's story moved something in you, leave a comment below with the moment that stayed with you longest. There are more stories like this one waiting, and every comment tells us what you most want to hear.